right, guys. I hope this quiz went well for you. It went well for most of you. So I was pretty pleased with the response all in all. Let me just, oh, sorry. This recording. Yes, it is recording. And I am screen sharing, yes. Okay. All right, so. Terrible. All right, so dosage regimen design quiz. A drug's clearance is dependent upon the elimination rate constant. Does the clearance depend upon the slope of the line or the elimination rate constant? This is the slope of this line of our concentration time curve. Is that what determines, or is our clearance dependent upon that? No. The other way, our K is dependent upon clearance and volume. This is the dependent variable. This is independent, as is volume. Your clearance is dependent upon blood flows and kidney function, etc. K is dependent upon clearance and volume. So this is a big old false, yeah? I think most of you did well on that. If the CSS average of a drug is too high, so CSS average, which is determined by bioavailable dose rate over clearance, is high, what could have caused that? A decrease in clearance, or an increase in bioavailability, or an increase in dose rate? Remember, this is, again, the dependent variable. So the result is an increase in CSS average. So one of those things happened. So the CSS average is too high, and the peak to trough ratio is too small. Remember, the peak to trough ratio is dependent upon the dosing interval, which is what we decide, and the clearance and volume, because they determine the slope of that line, or K, right? So if it's too small, it's putting our patient at risk. In relative terms, how would you adjust the dosing regimen? Well, the first thing you ask is, do I want to change my dose rate? How do I decide if I want to make a dose rate change? I look at my CSS average. What do we know? The CSS average is too high. Therefore, what do we control in this situation? We control the dose rate. So what are we going to do? We're going to decrease the dose rate. Therefore, decrease the dose rate. Decrease the dose rate. If the if the peak to trough ratio, so we have a peak to trough ratio, and the peak to trough ratio is too small, so the difference between the peak and the trough is too small, what do we control of these three things? We control the dose interval, don't we? So what would we do if we wanted that peak to trough ratio to be larger? Well, we're going to extend the dosing interval, because now our peak to trough ratio is larger, isn't it? So we want to change our dose interval. Yes. We look at peak to trough, and therefore we want to increase our dose interval, or our tau. Another way to look at it is looking at our half-life. Well, if our peak, no, I won't do that here. Okay, so we want to decrease our dose rate and increase our tau. If you only got one of these right, you were wrong, because we have to get both of those right in order to have the right dosing regimen and therefore the right thing for the patient. So it's important these two both have to be correct. You don't get partial credit. If your patient George is taking 250 milligrams Q6 of drug X and the CSS average is double of what it should be, so the CSS average is too high. It's too high. And the peak to trough ratio is in the desired range, what will the new regimen be for your patient George of drug X? Well, let's look at both dose rate and dose interval. How do we decide if we want to change dose rate? We look at CSS average. Well, our CSS average, again, is too high. So what are we going to do? We're going to decrease the dose rate, right? How do we decide if we want to change our dose interval? We look at peak to trough ratio. Our peak to trough ratio is in the desired range. So therefore, we're going to have no change in tau. Well, knowing this, what is our dose rate? Our dose rate is 250 Q6. So there's 4 of these a day. So the dose rate is 1,000 milligrams per day, isn't it? And our dose interval is 6 hours. So we know we're going to keep the tau the same. So we're going to give whatever it is every 6 hours. And we're going to decrease our dose rate in half. So therefore, it's going to be 500 milligrams Q per day is our new dose rate. So we're going to give 500 milligrams per day, but we need to chop it up into 4 pieces. So what's 500 divided by 4? 1, 4 goes into that 2 times, that's 8 and 20. So it's 125 milligrams every 6 hours. Again, if you didn't get both of these pieces right, you didn't get full credit. You need to have all of it right for your patient. Volume and distribution is a determinant. So what does volume and distribution determine? Does it determine CSS average? No. What does determine CSS average? Bioavailability, dose rate, and clearance. How about bioavailability? What determines bioavailability? Well, we haven't talked about it yet, but volume and distribution has nothing to do with what the fraction of drug is that reaches systemic circulation. So nope. How about clearance? Does volume determine clearance? What determines clearance? Well, I think we already said we haven't really learned it yet, but it's blood flows and that sort of thing, right? Volume distribution is a separate entity from clearance, so it does not determine clearance. Does it determine K? Well, what determines K? Clearance over volume. So volume distribution does determine K, and that will rule out that one. If the area of the curve and CSS average of a drug have increased and the K has decreased, what has caused this? Okay, so CSS average is bioavailable dose rate over clearance. And what has happened? This has increased. So it's either due to a decrease in bioavailability, a decrease in clearance, an increase in bioavailability, or an increase in dose rate. Will any of these things affect K? Well, yes, K is determined by clearance and volume. So if you decrease clearance, oopsie, you will also decrease K, won't you? So what shows this? What's in common here? A decrease in clearance. So that's your answer there, a decrease in clearance. You have to be a little bit of a detective there. Because remember, clearance affects both peak to trough ratio and CSS average. A decrease in the volume of distribution would be expected to cause what? Okay, so a decrease in volume distribution. Does a decrease in volume distribution affect clearance? We just answered this. No, it won't cause a decrease in clearance. A need to decrease dose rate. Well, what determines dose rate? Well, we have to look at CSS average. So CSS average is determined by bioavailable dose rate over clearance. Is volume a part of this, a determinant of CSS average, and therefore a change in dose rate? No. An increase in CSS average? Well, we already talked about CSS average. No. A need to decrease dose interval. Okay, this one we need to think about a little bit. So dose interval is determined by peak to trough ratio, right? And, or at least we look at peak to trough ratio to decide if we want to make a change in dose interval. So what's going to happen to our peak to trough ratio if we have a decrease in volume? If we have a decrease in volume, what's going to happen to K? Our K is going to increase, right? So that smaller volume of distribution, the drug is going to be more available to those clearance organs, and your K is going to, your slope of your line is going to go from this to this. It's going to get a larger peak to trough ratio, right? Not doing a good job of this drawing, but you're going to have a larger peak to trough ratio. So our peak to trough ratio is increased. So we could have some toxicity here, a lack of efficacy here. So what are we going to need to do? We're going to need to decrease the dose interval. We're going to have to chop it up into smaller pieces so we can have a smaller peak to trough ratio, more like a constant infusion. So this one is correct. Describe the relationship between volume distribution and half-life. Well, if you remember, K is equal to clearance over volume, and half-life, which is just the inverse of K, is 0.693 volume over clearance. This is the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is going to go on the y-axis, and the independent variable here, volume, will go on the x-axis because it's the independent variable. As volume increases, what's going to happen to the half-life? It's going to increase. So this is a proportional relationship. So the dependent variable, again, is volume. Or I'm sorry, the dependent is half-life. The independent is volume. And that relationship is proportional. So I wanted you to describe the relationship. You have to have all of these three correct in order to get that correct. Your patient Henry is on 1 gram of cefazolin every 6 hours. So before we go on, what's the dose rate here in amount of drug per day? So the dose rate here is 1 gram every 6. So it's 4 grams per day. What's the dose interval? 6 hours, right? So that's our original. Suddenly goes into sepsis and it's acute renal failure, which is a decrease in clearance. So how would you expect to need to alter his dosing regimen? Assume everything should be double or half. Okay, so how are we going to decide if we want to make a change in dose rate? What do we look at? CSS average, right? CS average is bioavailable dose rate over clearance. What's happened? There's a decrease in clearance. Our CSS average is increased. So what do we want to do? We want to decrease the dose rate. If we want it to be in half, our new dose rate is going to be 2 grams per day. How about dose interval? What do we look at? Peak to trough ratio and K. So K is clearance over volume. Your clearance is decreased. Your K is decreased. We can also look at half-life. Your clearance is decreased. Your half-life is increased. So what's happened to the slope of our line? It's gotten flatter, hasn't it? So what's happened to our peak to trough? If it was like this before and now it's like this, our peak to trough ratio is decreased, isn't it? So how do we increase that peak to trough ratio? We extend the dosing interval. And remember, tau follows that half-life. So what are we going to want to do? We're going to want to increase our tau. We were at 6 hours. We want to be at 12 hours. So if we're giving 2 grams a day, but we're giving it every 12 hours, we're going to break that into 2 pieces, right? So our new dosing regimen will be 1 gram Q 12 hours. Again, you have to get both pieces of this to get that correct. This should be an easy one. The bioavailability of a drug depends upon the clearance. No. No, it does not. They're both independent variables in this case. The area under the curve in CSS average of a drug has increased. So we have an increase in CSS average. What could cause this? Bioavailable dose rate over clearance. So it could either be an increase in bioavailability, a decrease in clearance, or we could have increased the dose rate. Well, we didn't increase the dose rate, but we do have an increase in F, a decrease in F. No, that would decrease this area under curve and CSS average. Change in volume won't affect CSS average and area under the curve. So it's A. After each midterm, there will be a learning session scheduled that will concentrate on the concepts in the exam that were most difficult. This session is required for those who scored less than 73, optional for others. Well, that's partially true, but required for those who scored less than 73 that want to qualify to take a remediation exam. That's true. If you don't care about taking the remediation exam, you don't have to come to the relearning. So this one is true. It's not optional for all students. It's only optional for those that got 73 or better. It is not required for all students. So this one could have been a little tricky, but it's really only if you want to take the exam. The student may remediate one midterm exam. The exam score will be average. No, we don't average. We take your best score. That's it. Hope you did. Hope this cleared up any misconceptions. And I appreciate your time in going over this. If you still have a question, please ask your tutors or myself. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.